So a while back, Orithous asked, "What made you guys limit influence and parts to 9,999?" And Cog242 is quoting him and making sure that I remember this question because it's an important one. Because actually, that limit has led to some pain for players over the years, especially when we added the Forever Communities update, and players gained the ability to sort of basically sell their old base and spend a lot of influence to claim a new base on a new map. Not just a starter base, but any base they wanted to. Some of them costing quite a bit if they had never settled in that base before. And we actually had a problem. I think I almost kind of want to consider this a bug that crept in. There's an order of operations problem when you're moving maps where you will not get the benefit of selling a lot of your old base until after you have already had to pay for your new base. And so because we don't give you all of the money up front and then let you spend it, there's some potential loss there, partly because you can't spend it all on the new base, and partly because if after you sort of sell all of your old outposts, which have been upgraded multiple times, each of which costs influence, you will end up not having enough room in your influence stockpile to contain all of the stuff that you sold. And now if you had sold it up front and then bought the most expensive base, you might actually be able to use some of that influence, and it wouldn't be as big of a problem. Because we have the order of operations problem, you end up with just a giant pile of influence landing in your stockpile if you had a very well-developed base with a lot of outposts in the previous map, and most of that influence just goes to waste. It just goes off into the ether because it went over and beyond the stockpile limit. And so that's the context, I think, in which Orithous is asking about these stockpile limits. Why do we limit you to 9,999 influence? Why do we limit you to the same number of parts? So there are a few different reasons why we have these kinds of limits in the game. And I'm not saying that the specific limits we've chosen are necessarily the right ones. We recently, with the Juggernaut edition, we increased the limit for prestige because we wanted to give a bunch of prestige rewards at the time that Juggernaut was released, but we knew that a lot of people had already maxed out their prestige and they wouldn't have room for it. And so we were like, you know what? People don't earn a ton of prestige anyway at a huge rate. It's not going to be a big impact on the economy of the game. Let's raise it by a digit, and then we can give them all giant piles of prestige, which we think they deserve for supporting our game for so long, right before we made big chunks of the game free for all new players, or at least no additional charge for all new players. So we have raised them before. That doesn't mean, and that means that theoretically we could raise them again if we wanted to. But let's talk about the reasons why to have limits at all. One reason is just a logistical limit, like anything that you build with code needs to have limits in it, because computers are if you tell a computer to keep adding 1 to a number, it will do it. It will do it forever until something breaks. You have to have some value that when it hits that value, it stops adding, or things can go really, really weird. For instance, we had a problem when we first released State of Decay 2. We had a major problem, which was we had not capped the size of your legacy pool. So you could finish a legacy, send all the characters into the legacy pool, start a new community, finish it, send all those characters into the legacy pool, and you could keep repeating that cycle endlessly, and your legacy pool would get larger and larger and larger and larger and larger, and we had put no cap on that whatsoever. And what that eventually led to was people's save files got so huge that actually there was a hard limit on how big a save file could be if it was stored on Xbox Live, if it was stored in the cloud. And so people hit a point where if they had won the game a certain number of times, their game would just stop saving because their save was too big to go to the cloud, and all of their saving was happening on the cloud. And so we had kind of an emergency hotfix we had to do. I think we actually packaged it with one of our regular updates, maybe. I don't remember exactly if it went out as a hotfix or not, but we had an emergency problem to solve, which was we had to cap the size of your legacy pool so that your save file could not get that big. Because computers have limits. There is always an outer limit somewhere on something that is running on a computer, and if you don't think about that outer limit, at some point you're going to violate it, and then you're screwed. The Y2K bug was all about that. People not thinking ahead to how a number could get really high and then cause a problem. If they didn't think ahead to how to limit that number or how to process that number as it got ridiculously high. So That's one reason for it. And so we had to have some kind of limit. There was definitely not a world where we could say, oh, yes, you can have an unbounded amount of influence. Because at some point, when that number got into the, hundreds of billions, it would cause problems. Obviously, I don't think anyone's going to get hundreds of billions, but you know what I'm saying. At some point, we have to cap out the size of the UI. The UI has got to fit in a certain space. And, we've got a limit. Like, there's only so many digits we can fit in there, and so we have to choose one. And it doesn't mean that it has to be a particular size. We could have chosen 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 digits if we wanted to. We chose 4 digits. And so there was a couple of different reasons why there had to be a limit at all. So why have the limit be 4 digits in particular? So that came down to trying to balance our economy. There is a failed state that a character's economy, that a player's economy can get into, where there's failed states in 2 directions. There's one failed state where you literally cannot get enough of a resource that you need in order to fund your operations, and you get frustrated and you get into this negative spiral where you just can't do anything and you feel trapped. And so that's, for instance, I believe is what is the motivation behind why food outposts in the lethal zone create more food than food outposts in the green zone, why we match it to players, to characters' food intake, because we want to make sure that players, in the lethal zone didn't get into such a horrible food spiral that the game just wasn't fun to play anymore. And so there's that end of the spectrum where, something is so precious and so dear and you can't get enough of it that you just can't function. But there's also a failed state the other direction where you get so much of something that it becomes trivial, and basically everything that costs that resource is effectively free. That is also a bad state to get into. Like, imagine, if you had 1 million influence, you would upgrade all of your outposts instantaneously. There would be no progression to your outposts. Outposts would always be level 3 immediately. And, and everything from a trader would just be free. And a lot of the sort of the challenge of, like when you sit down to play a game of State of Decay 2, a lot of what you're looking at is, I don't have enough of this yet. I need to go get it so that I can do something cool that I want to do. And if we get you into a situation, or if we let you get into a situation where all of those challenges, all of those things that you're missing, are no longer missing, you have everything you could possibly need forever, then that struggle is gone, and the motivation to play the game is gone, and the fun, the challenge of playing the game is gone. It becomes sort of like an idle little, time waster for your thumbs. It doesn't become, it's no longer an engaging economy. And so when we were looking at influence, I think Brian was looking at it and he was like, I could give people another digit of influence, but if I did, the amount of influence they could accumulate at that point could cross the line into influence being trivial. And because, especially if you're a trader, because Orithous you're constantly bringing up that I should be a trader in State of Decay 2 because a trader has access to the ability to buy so many different things. If you were a trader and if you had 5 digits of influence and you could maintain that level of influence fairly trivially, then basically everything in the game is now free for you. And the game isn't challenging anymore. And I think even though that sounds like an attractive thing, like, oh, wow, I'm so successful, everything is free. I mean, if you want that, I'm sure there's mods that can provide it. But, like, for us, like, thinking of our responsibility to make a game that people find entertaining, it's difficult for us to justify making a choice that could do that to players and make it so that a lot of the challenge goes away, a lot of the interest that you develop in overcoming obstacles goes away. So I think that order of operations problem, when you're moving maps, that wastes so much influence because of the cap, I think we should solve that. I think that we should fix that order of operations problem so that that one particular source of it's a very legitimate, a very common source of frustration. I think that we should fix that problem. And it could easily be that we were wrong about where that threshold of triviality is. That actually influence inflation will not get so bad that it would ruin the game if we allowed you another digit. It's entirely possible that that's true, and that we could give you another digit and the game wouldn't be messed up. But I'm not sure that that's true. It might be that the threshold where influence becomes trivial and the game becomes less fun, it might be somewhere between 10,000 and 100,000. And if the threshold is in there, then I think we actually do have a responsibility to try to keep influence under control by keeping the cap that high. Now, there are other ways to do caps. You don't necessarily have to do a hard cap in a place like that. You could do things, other things that, like say for instance, have things that things you want to spend influence on, influence sinks that get increasingly expensive. Where it's like, for instance, you could have a late game offering that is only 10% better than the thing that you could get earlier in the game, but it costs 3 times as much. You can put things like that in a game so that somebody who has earned that much influence can be like, oh, I can buy the fancy thing now. I can go out and get the Wagyu steak instead of the regular steak. And you're like, is it that much better? Actually, yeah, it is pretty good. I've only had it like once, and it's really good. But is it so much better that it's worth that amount of money? We can set things up so that it's really not, so that like there's a thing you could spend a lot of influence on that isn't actually worth that much influence, but that could be an attractive thing for late game players to spend the cash on. That's another way to make an economy like that. We're going to avoid that that really bad inflation problem. So you can basically raise the cap to the point where nobody will get there because there's so many things to buy that would just eat it all up. But that takes a lot of careful tuning and planning and stuff that we weren't in a position to do on State of Decay 2. But that kind of thing is possible. There are ways to do it. It just takes a lot of thought, and it's more complicated than it looks like on the surface. Anyway, I scrolled the chat all the way up in order to read the question, which means I missed everything that you all said while I was going off on that rant. So let me see here. Ranithcord says there's also a fun bug where if you were on green, the base on the next map chooser shows half-priced bases, even if you aren't going to green. So if you don't actually have enough money to buy the base on the new difficulty, then you won't get a base in the new map, and all your cars won't come along either. Oh, what? Okay, I had not heard about that. Has that been reported? That sounds really bad. We should not be doing that. Let's see here. Okay, so if you're watching this later on YouTube, there was a massive pause for me to collect my thoughts, followed by me repeating a lot of what I had just said, because I just completely lost my train of thought. And when it happened, Lecovalicion said, don't cut that pause. Keep it in, and in fact, slow time to enlarge it. I don't think I'm going to do that. And I think if you're watching this later on YouTube, if I did my job, you had no idea. You probably saw a little jump cut and thought it was small and didn't realize that I actually skipped about 2 minutes. Because no, I'm not doing that, La Coalición. People who watch this on YouTube, I have a responsibility to them to try to make this as palatable as possible. And watching me stare off into space and then repeat the previous 2 minutes of things that I had said, not going to be their favorite thing I ever did. Let's see here. Renethcord says, everything is already free. Just don't sell stuff. Your supply locker is effectively just an extra influence cap. So that's the thing. Like, you do so much of just finding of stuff in the world. It is, you're absolutely right that people in State of Decay 2 are oftentimes not rich because they have a lot of influence. They're rich because they have a lot of stuff. Stuff is what you really get wealth in State of Decay 2, and we don't really have a cap on that, and we don't have an attractive sink for it. Like, you can mulch things for parts and you can sell them, but you also get parts and influence at their own elevated rate when you're playing really well, and so you also kind of don't need those either. And so that is something that we're thinking about, and I won't get into any details, obviously, about State of Decay 3, but we have been thinking about, what do we let players do? Like, is there a way for us to give people an equipment sink? Some motivation to want to get rid of equipment so that their supply locker stays manageable, instead of just incentivizing endless hoarding, because there's nothing better to do with a gun than keep it. We don't have an announceable solution to that, but that is a thing we think about. We talk about that kind of stuff because that is a major problem in State of Decay 2. The fact that there is not a good way to a good motivation to mulch your weapons, unless you're just someone like me who just likes mulching his weapons. I like having a very sort of a small and sparing supply locker, and so I will mulch weapons just for the heck of mulching weapons. But most people are not like that, and so we can't make the game just for weirdos like me. We have to make the game for everybody. Yeah, so Orithous says, you definitely do not need mods to keep high influence. If you're focused on it, there's enough methods in the game, basically, of raising your influence incomes, that you can just keep it maintained at 9999 at all times. Okay, Ranthcore says he did report that bug, so I've got no idea how the bugs are being prioritized, or they as far as they sail over my head into a different place these days, and so I'm not really involved in prioritizing them or anything like that. So I hope that kind of thing gets fixed. That'll be great. Anyway, Side Chat says thank you for answering that. And let's see. Oh, Fulton suggests that one thing we could do is have an escalating cap that goes up over time so that we could keep it low when we want it to be low, but let players raise it in some way. He's suggesting, for instance, tying it to population. Though we also cap your population pretty harshly, actually. So that particular one might not work. But having a way for a player to sort of buy into an escalating cap, like, for instance, spending 9,000 influence on a raised influence cap, I mean, that's the kind of thing people do all the time. That could totally work. Anyway, okay. Orithous actually said, please raise the legacy pool by 20. So I genuinely don't know. When Lewis put on that legacy cap, he chose 50 as just sort of a reasonable number. And he was the one who actually knew how expensive characters were to save and how much over the limit we were going. And I think he was trying to be future-proofed, which means that he was trying to set a limit that wasn't like just barely keeping things under the wire. He tried to set it in such a way that, like, we could do more things that make the save files bigger and we had plenty of margin. So I think theoretically the legacy pool could get larger. However, the grid that they're stored on, does it scroll? It scrolls, right? If it scrolls, then theoretically the UI would not be a limitation. But for instance, when we did Forever Communities, we went from 3 to 5 save slots. And I'm not actually sure if those saves are treated all independently. I think they might be. I think those might all be independent. So that might have not... those might be all separate files. So those might not have pushed against the limit. The way that the single sort of central file that keeps track of your legacy, that one, it had to be one big file. And that had all your characters in it. I think that was the one save file that couldn't be saved. Maybe? I'm not sure. Maybe they all do have to be wrapped up in one save. I'm not enough of a technical person to know, so I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if we could raise it. It could be that 50 is actually the limit it needs to be at, and there's not a lot we can do about it. It might be possible in this room, but then we want to be cautious in case there's something else we want to do in the future that could raise the size of save files. And then because contracting those legacy pools, I mean, at least back then you couldn't browse the legacy pools, so people couldn't really, I think most people didn't notice that they had lost characters because they had so many anyway, and they didn't remember what most of them were. I think we deliberately tried to focus on, because we had to delete characters for people. I think we focused on trying to delete characters that people didn't use very much. Like if a character had been used more than once, for instance, we tried not to delete that character because clearly the player would remember them and had invested in them. But we did have to delete characters that had not been used before, or at least hadn't been used a second time, in order to get the people who had gone way over the limit back down to the 50. I think that if we raised it by 20, like Orithous is suggesting, and then found out that was a bad idea, we'd be stuck. We can't take it back down again once you can browse your entire legacy pool of 70 and then see that you've lost 20 of them. Like, that would be a mess. So, like, we have to be very cautious about giving you more stuff, because if we ended up realizing, oh crap, no, that was too much, we can't take it away, because that would feel real bad. I'm sure there's at least a handful of players for whom it felt really bad to lose a chunk of their legacy pool when we made that fix. And we knew that we were taking a big risk by doing that, but we couldn't think of another option that would actually solve the problem for people. So Incredible Mouse says, I mod out all the limits and bars. I play to experience the world in the quest. Staying alive, taking damage, and watching money are utterly irrelevant to my good time. I'm an outlier. And yeah, and one thing I always have to recognize is that I'm an outlier in the other direction. I tend not to be playing for the story and the world. I tend to be playing for the simulation, for the economy, for the the stuff that I can achieve and build and craft and that sort of thing. And so I tend to be an outlier the other way. So I have to try to remember that there are players on the other end of the spectrum. In fact, I'm recording this on the heels of having done a stream of the Outer Worlds, where I was talking about the fact that the reason I didn't engage with the game was because it didn't have it was more focused on the storytelling and the characters than it was on sort of the exploration and the economy, which is what I tend to engage with. Yeah, Paroxicus is pointing out that we have done, giving you power and taking it away before. Like, for instance, the Haven device, we gave it to you and then took it away. At least we nerfed it down a little bit. And the justification for that, I mean, so I was off the team by the time they did it, but the justification for that was something that made sense. The reason that I wanted to give you the Haven device was because I think you and I all agreed sieges were stupid and annoying. And so what I was giving you was not meant to be a cool tool and a part of the interesting simulation. I was giving you a way out of sieges because I hated sieges so much. And the reason I hated sieges was because they were just inexorable. They would just happen on a schedule every so often, and there was nothing you could do to make them stop, to hold them off. They were just a frustrating reason why I kept having to come home or sacrifice a bunch of ammo to defend my base. It felt like a drag on the game that didn't make it any more fun. And I was like, I just don't like this part of the game. I have a cheap way to give you a way out of it if you're a long-term player. And so here you go. Here's the Haven device. Get it. You don't worry about sieges anymore. And then the folks, the team developing the Heart Attack update, made the sieges fun again. They made it so that you had so many tools for preventing a siege, and the siege was actually at the far end of a long series of events that you could control and interact with at every step along the way. And suddenly I enjoyed sieges as a potential thing. I don't have them very often because I engage so much with the Heart Attack features that I never have sieges anymore, with or without a Haven device, because I'm just so engaged with the whole broader system, and I love the system now. I'm not angry at sieges anymore. And so I didn't fight to keep the Haven device in its current state, which I would have been ineffective anyway because I wasn't even on the team anymore. Who cares what I think? But I didn't fight because I was like, yeah, the whole reason I gave you the Haven device was because the game sucked in a way that it no longer sucks. So the Haven device is less useful now. It kills a certain number of zombies before it goes on cooldown, and then it won't really protect you from a siege in the same way. But I mean, honestly, like, if sieges had always worked the way they work now in State of Decay 2, never would have made the Haven device in the first place. So Orithous says he still hates sieges. Well, Magic Man says, now nothing happens at the base. I miss sieges. So yeah, this sort of illustrates one of the problems with game development, is that, like, the audience is just so diverse. All of you feel differently about every part of the game than everyone else. Like, I've got this a chat with 24 people in it. All of you are having 24 very distinct experiences with that game, and some handful of you might actually have come here because you thought I was playing the Outer Worlds still, and you're not here for State of Decay 2 at all, which is a very different opinion about State of Decay 2. So like, you're experiencing the game in so many different ways. Any choice we make is going to be weird for someone in some negative way, and it's tough because we're always trying to play this numbers game. We're like, okay, what is going to make the game as good as it can be for the biggest chunk of the audience that we need to have? Like, and it's like there's so many reasons to make or to not make every decision. Feeling your way through something like that and trying to find the best route is hazardous, and we do our best. And I think there's some people who are better at it than others at sort of feeling out the particular community that our game has, understanding what will best serve that community. But it's not easy, and if somebody doesn't get it, I don't blame them. This is hard, I mean, one of the reasons why I have this stream is so that I can motivate myself to continuously play State of Decay 2, to always be in the audience for State of Decay 2, so that I remember what it's like to be in that audience, so that I can serve that audience. And I think that gives me an advantage. It gives me sort of a role to play on the State of Decay 3 team that I think is really valuable, because I'm playing the game so much and talking to people who play the game differently from me so much that I can sort of keep my finger on the pulse of our audience and understand what they're looking for. And there's a lot of people who don't necessarily play the game as much as I do, and that's totally fine. Not everyone on the team has to, but someone on the team has to. And so I try to like make that one of my responsibilities is I need to be a State of Decay 2 player and also know a lot of State of Decay 2 players so that we can make the best choices we can for State of Decay 2 players. But State of Decay 2 players are not going to be the only audience for State of Decay 3. There will be brand new people who come in who love State of Decay 3 who never would have gotten into State of Decay 2. And we also have to make decisions for them. So I am one voice on the team, but I am not the only voice, and I shouldn't be the only voice, because we need to serve both the existing audience we have and a broader audience that comes in later. And so, like, it's just freaking complicated. And so we're doing our best, but it takes a long time to solve problems like that. And so I appreciate your patience. Anyway, okay, I got onto way more topics than I intended to here, but I think this definitely is its own viewer question video, so let's do an end screen. There is a subscribe button. Here's links to other viewer questions. I typically put the next one up here when it's available, and I put the previous one down here, so you can go forwards or backwards through these if you want to. And, yeah, there you go. Enjoy.